All right, so welcome to today's episode of my Leveraging Your Voice podcast. And today is a special day. This is the first episode of its type. This is meant to be strictly a training episode. Now, when I say strictly, I don't mean it won't be fun. We're going to have some fun. But our goal here is to do a training on a really important topic, which is business brand versus personal brand. And there's so much about this topic that I think we need to know. And if you're watching and you're anything like me, you find yourself in a very confused state every time this topic comes up. So you can see on the screen that I have invited a very special guest, Jennifer White, to be with us today. And I asked her, this is now her second visit. So there's many firsts here. It's the first training episode we've ever done. And it's the first time I've had a repeat guest. So Jen, you're like in a class by yourself at this point.
I love it. I love being the first and I love helping you out.
Awesome. So I'm Paul Rakowicz with prvocalcoaching.com and I help people speak with confidence. Jen, you are?
I am Jennifer White. I'm with Five and Rise Marketing Group, and we help businesses elevate their brand awareness to ignite growth.
That's awesome. Now today, Jen, we're going to talk about business brand versus personal brand.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that I struggled with is I would look at the Book Yourself Solid system, and I would look at the section 1.3 where it talks about personal brand. And no matter how many times I looked at that, I still ended up confused. Now, maybe if you're watching, you think, hey, Paul's not that bright. Maybe I'm not. But I think that I was confused because I couldn't figure out in there some of what was going on, because a lot of times I would look at what's in there and I'd say, but that's what I use for my business brand, but it has it here in personal brand. And I think of my who and do what statement. Well, my who and do what statement is what my business does and who they do it for. And my tagline is for my business. It's like the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket, or whatever the tagline was. Well, that's not a personal brand. That was a business brand thing. And I could never really make sense of it. But I think you have made sense of it. I don't think there's anything there that's wrong, but I think it's a way of how do I understand it? And how do I understand it in terms of business brand versus personal brand? And how do I break it out so I understand what to do with that section? So before we dive into that section, can you just tell us what is business brand? What is personal brand? So we get a sense just of what they are, because we need to understand each one, but then, man, we need to understand how they work together, because that's really important.
Right. And there is a difference. And I think that is confusing to some people, because so often what we see is the company brand, the business brand, the corporate brand. That's what is in front of us all the time. But we don't think about that personal brand, which is actually something, right, that goes into building the business. And we'll get more into that and how they integrate. But so let's start with the personal brand. A personal brand is really who you are. It's who you are. It's what you do. It's why you do what you do. It's your authentic story. And it's how you share that with the world, really. And so there are a lot of different things that go into your personal brand. There are things that are different than what you would put in a company business brand. And there are some things that are similar that what you would put in a company business brand. But your personal brand really is about you and the authenticity that you bring to whatever it is that you're doing, whatever it is that you're working on, whatever it is that you're building, and whatever it is that you want other people to know about you and why they should be in relationship with you. And that's really what a personal brand does. Business brand or a corporate brand is all about the company or the entity or the business that you're building, whether you're a coach, a solopreneur, a small business, a medium-sized business, a big business, all the way up to a corporate or even a Fortune 500, 100 type of business. There's a brand associated with that business entity. And that brand is a little bit more formal in that it talks about, the vision, mission, and the corporate statement, tagline. It also will include your logo and your brand colors, and a lot of different things that go into that business brand. Talk about your ideal client, and we'll kind of dig into those parts and pieces too. But the difference is that business brand is about the entity, right? It's about the company and the culture of the company and everything that goes into the company and their product and what they're selling. And so there's a distinct difference between a personal brand and a company brand.
That's a good start. Now, I think one of the common examples of a company brand versus a personal brand is Apple and Steve Jobs. Apple is a brand, and Steve Jobs has passed away, and that brand continues with the company. But Steve Jobs had his own personal brand that people would talk about. What is Steve Jobs about? Who is he as a person, and what drives him? And talk about that separate from Apple.
Absolutely.
And it's a great example of a corporate brand versus a personal brand and what each sort of thing does.
Right. Absolutely.
Where do you want to take us next in this conversation?
So let's talk a little bit about that example of Steve Jobs and Apple, because I think it does. I think one of the things that people get confused about is, why do I need a personal brand? If I'm starting a business or, I'm trying to build something, I'm working on that. Who cares about my personal brand? And as a matter of fact, I was talking to a client the other day that was really struggling with, well, I just want to work on my business. I don't really want to work on my personal brand. And I said to them, and this kind of goes back to Steve Jobs, is, Steve Jobs was with Apple and he built Apple, but he also stepped away from the company. And when he stepped away from the company, he didn't leave Steve Jobs at Apple. He took Steve Jobs with him. He put all his heart, soul, blood, sweat, tears into building Apple. But when he stepped away, he still had all that blood, sweat, tears that built Apple, but it was all part of him. He wrote a book. He spoke. He got into some other business ventures. He did a lot of different things as Steve Jobs, not as Apple. And that's kind of the difference. And I was sharing that with my client who was struggling between, I don't want to build my personal brand, I just want to build my business brand. And I said, okay, but you just recently had somebody that was interested in potentially looking at buying your company. And so when they buy that company, you no longer are going to be attached to that company, at least at some point, right? You might be for the near future, but when you go away, what's left if you don't build that personal brand? So what you need to do is build your personal brand alongside your business brand if you're doing things together and you haven't built a personal brand. But if you haven't quite started your entrepreneurial goals and dreams and that business that you're building, I would start with a personal brand, because that stays with you and the business stays with the business. And that's the difference between the two as well. And that's why they're very different.
Well, that's a good example, and it brings to light a part of why we want to know about this subject and why we want to be able to understand how to do each. So that's a big deal, and I want to dive into that a little bit more as we go. I want to get into section 1.3 of book
Sure.
Solid. And I think you have the book there.
I do have the book.
Expert, subject matter expert that you are. And I think you're going to actually read some things out of there for us, which I think is good. So why don't we dive into that a little bit and show us what you see there that's really nice, and then what you see there that has to go beyond what's there, so that we can sort of start to see how you take that section and start to make two parts so we can understand what's corporate brand, what's personal brand.
Sure. And I think that there is some confusion in this particular chapter, and not to say that it's right or wrong in any way, shape, or form. I think also when the book was written, and also I'm not sure when the book was written who necessarily was the ideal client of the book, but I think that this particular chapter combines a lot of that personal brand and that corporate brand together. And I think as people move out of that solopreneur and turn more towards entrepreneurship or building a business or building a company, that's when things start separating a little bit, and your personal brand really becomes your personal brand and your company brand really becomes your company brand. And so I actually, when I was reading this the first time through, you can see, like, I've had it at the pool, I've had it all over, but I actually started underlining some different passages in this particular chapter that really dug into the parts that are what I would consider a personal brand. And there's some things that when I'm working with people on building their personal brand really relate to that. And then there are other things that really relate to more of that company brand. And so I kind of separated those out as well, because when I'm working with a client, I'm usually working on a personal brand or a company brand, and then sharing with them how they intersect with one another and how one is used for the other. And again, we're going to kind of dig into that, but I think that is where the confusion is in this chapter 3 or 1.3 of Book Yourself Solid, because it really does combine the parts and pieces of a personal brand and a company brand. And so we're going to talk about how to separate those out, and what is good use for a company brand versus a personal brand.
So let's look into that now. Let's start breaking them down. How do we look at that section and start breaking down personal brand, company brand? How might you want to do that? Because I know when someone comes to your business, you have two different areas. Hey, here's what you're going to do to build your business brand. Here's what you're going to do to build your personal brand. Maybe that's the place to start, and how that then ties back.
So I think, in relation to this particular book, this particular chapter, I think if I share some of the things that I underlined in this, and these are some of the things that I teach when we're building a personal brand, and I even go beyond this when I'm actually working with a client, or we're trying to, figure out where they fall from a personal brand and a business brand. So let's kind of look at those things and the things that we would put into that personal brand. And then as we're going through that, I can kind of point out, this is what I would split out from a personal brand versus a business brand.
Let's dive in.
Okay. All right. So I'm not going to read the whole chapter. I'm probably not going to cover most of the chapter, but I'm just going to share some of the things that I took out of it from putting together a personal brand. And the first sentence that I underlined in here was, personal branding is far more than just what you do or what your website and business cards look like. It is you, uniquely you. And that is a huge difference between a company brand and a personal brand, because that personal brand really is uniquely you. It's what sets you apart. It is why you do what you do, why you are who you are. And it really dives into putting together and piecing together your story of why you do what you do. right? Which then why you do what you do, well, the what you do goes over into that business brand. Okay. So that was kind of that first sentence that I did. And kind of going further a little bit there, it talks about your brand is about what you stand for, and that's part of your personal brand. It could also be part of your company brand in how you define your company culture, right? And so, and what does the company stand for? And sometimes the personal brand and the company brand, in that what you stand for, they may be very similar or the same. But there are many times when you're building your personal brand and what you stand for may not be exactly what the company stands for, because it's a much bigger entity and there are very different goals that are aligned with a company versus a personal brand.
So this is one of the spots where we would want to just stop and think through this a little bit, because this is how we gain clarity in this concept of business brand versus personal brand. You said this concept of, okay, it's about you, but it's also, what is the company's about you concept? And that concept, that key concept is, when you're thinking personal and company brand, sometimes when you're thinking about one of the things related to it, the thought you have to have is, well, I have two of those, one for my personal and one for my corporate. So then you stop arguing in your brain. Is this personal brand or is it corporate brand? Yes.
Absolutely.
Now, it might even be the same, but mostly it's going to be, yeah, here's my personal brand. But when I'm over in the corporate brand, it's a little bit different. But it's, yes, it's for both of those. And when you started to talk about that with me as we were preparing for this call, that sort of lit the light bulb for me. Hey, I get it. I don't have to have this argument. Well, which is that? Is that personal brand or business brand?
Right.
It could be both. And once I open my mind to that thought, then the confusion starts to melt away. And then I say, okay, so tell me, what's the difference between those? And then you get the clarity and you can learn this topic really, really well. So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I do too. And I think you're right, Paul, in that is a point of confusion for many people, because they don't understand, because your personal brand, again, is just you, right? Where when you're defining what the company stands for and what that company culture looks like, now you're thinking not only about you, but you're thinking beyond you on a larger scope, right? Because you may have employees, or you may have business units, or you may have relationship partners or collaborators that you have to think about beyond yourself. And so that's how that grows, right? You kind of take what you stand for, and as you're building your business, that thought process, it grows, and it could grow into something completely different based on where you're taking your business.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting thing. You know, I think about me, why do I do vocal coaching? Well, my why and my personal brand is really a personal story. It connects to losing my wife and losing my voice and finding my voice and realizing this transformation about, I stopped being able to share myself with the world because I was afraid of loss. And then you get over that and you find your way through. And I did it through vocal coaching. And that's my personal story. But when I go over to PR vocal coaching, I can't, that's not the PR vocal coaching story. Is I want to help other people who have a problem speaking freely to be able to find their way to speak their truth to the world.
Right.
But that's not this story that drove me to create this, but it's what this story is that people connect to, that says, yeah, I'm struggling with confidence in speaking. Great. Now, if they say, how did you get into this? Well, then that's my story over here. Am I getting that right?
You are. And here's where the two intertwine. And I think your personal story is how people get to know you. and want to work with you, and they trust you, right? It's that whole cliche, know, like, trust. You can throw respect in there. You can throw, a lot of different things you can add on to that. But people don't want to just do business with a building or a logo or, right? They want to do business with the people that are within this. And when you're building that brand, that company, it starts with you. And so your story does play a huge part in what you're building. It also is, if you're not authentic about your story, it's going to show, and people are going to trust you less. And then they're not going to want to do business with you, or they're going to wait to do business with you until they know more about you, or they vet you more, or they talk to more people to learn about you. But if you are upfront with why you do what you do, why you love what you do, and you share that in some capacity, the trust is going to grow sooner. And so you're going to be able to do business with your ideal client sooner than later. And so that's where the two come together.
Yeah. So that was a good section. What's the next thing that we're going to talk about? Maybe the next thing you underlined. You're not like highlighting in black pen, right? Because then we wouldn't see it.
No, no, actually it's all underlined in red pen.
Okay, good. So what's the next one?
So the next one, it talks about developing a personal brand that looks like you, thinks like you, and sounds and feels like you. One that is instantly recognizable as your essence, right? And so again, this is really going back to you, who you are, the story of you, the story that you want to share with other people. It really kind of gets into your values and how you want to do business and all of the things that you have been thinking about and that you're working on bringing to light in your personal brand, right? That are eventually going to be part of the fabric of the brand that you're building. It's not completely, right? But you couldn't build this without who you are and why you're doing what you do.
For this one, I think to myself, for me, I want to do business on a handshake. That's who I am. From the business standpoint, okay, we need a little more than that. But in the business, that is reflected in my business in that I don't have this kind of paperwork. It's just a little bit. But that's how it appears in my business because of who I am and what my values are and what I want to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that, this is something for me, and I'm learning about this a little bit too as I'm building my company and my team, right? Is I am not a micromanager. I don't like to be micromanaged. I don't want to micromanage others. I want people to be autonomous in what they're doing. And I don't want them to feel like somebody's watching over them all the time, because I think that just takes away the confidence of people. And not to go too far down that, but that's kind of my personality, right? And that's part of my personal brand. And so when I'm looking at those things and I'm bringing it into the company, and I'm like, that looks like me, that feels like me. But when I go to the company and I try to implement that, then I'm actually getting feedback from my team that says, we would like a little bit more structure. We would like a little bit more structure. And so I need to learn how to give them that structure, which is very different than who I am personally, right? But I also want to make sure that for the good of the company, that the team is comfortable, that they're getting what they need, that they're getting the support that they need, and they don't feel like they're just out here flying alone. And I'm realizing that not everybody works the same way that I do. And so again, that's where you're bringing the essence of who you are into the company, but you're going to have to change it, massage it a little bit to grow something bigger outside of you personally.
And that's this concept that helps us unlock this whole thing. Personal brand, corporate brand, personal brand, business brand. Both, we're in both. These concepts we talk about are in both. So embrace that. They're two separate things, but embrace that many aspects of them are in both. And the question becomes, how does what you are get reflected in your business? But it still has to be a business. I mean, you still have to make a living. You still have to do your paperwork. You still have to have all these things in place. And people that work in a business expect certain things. You know, what time do I come in? What time am I done? They expect certain structure that they can work in.
Right.
So that's good. So one of the, I think, as we unwind this subject, I think it's one of those concepts that really help us in that self-development that every business owner needs to be constantly doing. Because the question of how we take who we are and reflect it in the business, but let it be in the business. That's like a really wonderful trick to do.
If you think about it too, if you go back to some of these other examples, you brought up Steve Jobs. Well, think about Steve Jobs. Like Steve Jobs is not with us any longer, right? And even when he left the company for a little bit of time, his essence and his presence was always felt at Apple because his personal brand was intertwined in the company forever. It is what it is, right? And you're not going to forget that. But when he steps away from that company, he can take his personal brand and his goals and his dreams and his desires and all of that onto the next thing, right? Yeah. The same thing with Phil Knight. We were talking about Nike, and you know, Phil Knight built Nike up, and his story behind the brand is pretty amazing story. If you guys haven't read Shoe Dog, you should read it. But it is, he could step away from it though, and Nike's always going to be Nike. You're going to have your swoosh logo, you know, your Just Do It tagline.
What's their tagline? Just do it.
Right.
Okay, so now think about that. So we look in section 1.3 and it says, what's your tagline? Well, in that section, it says that's your tagline for your personal thing. Okay, but I have a tagline in my business too. And so when I recognize that, that just becomes the key to making this simpler to understand. I can have my own tagline, but I can have one here, and I know the difference between them and how they fit and all that stuff, and it really works out well.
Yeah, and I will tell you that one of the things that we do often when we're building both a personal brand and a business brand is, from a business brand standpoint, a tagline is more relevant to a business, I believe. And how I differentiate that for folks is, for business, we might have a strap line, which is like for us, right? We're a marketing agency. And so we are Five and Rise is our company name, and our strap line is marketing group, right? It kind of defines what our company does. Now our tagline is elevate brand awareness to ignite growth. So that's our tagline. And I don't really see that necessarily as a personal tagline. And I think it's really hard to come up with your own tagline for you personally. What I do like to do, and what I work with clients on when we're building personal brand, is I like them to come up with their own signature quote. So instead of a tagline, we do a signature quote. So you might come up with, you know, something that means a lot to you or value, and you can come up with, and even sometimes just talking to somebody, and I'm sorry, because I don't have an example right in front of me that I can pull. I might be able to think of something here, but a lot of times in just talking to a particular client, as we're working through the parts and pieces of the brand, I can just pull out from what they're saying, their personal quote that really sums up their value and their story, and it's authentic to them. And so, yeah.
So I was working with Annie Solom, who I used to work on my branding, and I was talking and ranting and going through all kinds of crazy motions. And she goes, huh. And she writes down, happy, humble confidence. That's you. And that was my tagline, which we use over in the business too, but that's what I am about. Happy, humble confidence. So I didn't figure that out. I was just ranting along and
You were just talking and she
Yeah.
pulled it out. Yeah.
I wouldn't
Yeah,
say
so we-
talking. I would say I was ranting.
No, that's good. But those are things too, when you're talking and you're working through some of this with somebody else, right? Or if you're working with a coach or a mentor or an agency or whatever, those are things that allow you to just continue to talk about it and we learn about it, but then we're able to pull those parts and pieces out. And so often for the personal brand, we pull out something, massage it a little bit, and that it becomes your personal quote.
One of your key jobs, this is why I wanted to invite you on to talk about this.
I appreciate that.
It's not a scholarly conversation about bits and bytes or check boxes and all that. But this subject is more like you need to talk with someone like you, and as I would put it, and rant away about all kinds of things.
Right.
Your job specifically is to listen to all that noise and say, oh, this is who you are. That's what you bring to the table. And that's why I want to talk to you, to share how you go about that and how you break those out. What's the next one in the book that you wanted to share a little bit about?
So I think just kind of going back to how you put together a personal brand and the things that you're thinking about, and they define this pretty well in this chapter, is the things that it should include is that you should be clear, consistent, and consistency is important across everything that you're doing, right? Authenticity needs to be memorable, meaningful, soulful, and personal. Those are very relevant to a personal brand versus a business brand. And so those are things that are important in that frame.
I almost say to you, when you read all that and you're talking about it, I think, and we think about all the things you've been talking about, I connect with that really deeply, because on my personal brand, it is just all these feelings. But I don't want to put that on the other side. I got to say something.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, all these feelings, but then over here, it's these outcomes. And I feel that difference. And before we started preparing for this, I was confused though. But since we've been preparing, I'm starting to gain some clarity. Hey, I see what's happening. I can have all these feelings over here, and that's okay. That's part of my story. And that's part of being soulful and all those sorts of things. And I can be a little more professional over here and have outcomes that you're getting and things like that. Biggest value you're delivering, all those things. And those make sense there. So it's been a really interesting journey up to this point.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the things that sorry, this is one point that I do think is important as part of the personal brand. And I think some people might disagree with this, or they might have a different opinion about it. But I always tell people the really big thing that is important in developing your personal brand is your why, right? We've talked a little bit about that, why you do it, why you love what you're doing. And this, I underline this sentence, is that your work is likely to fail if you don't love it and share it with the world. And before, I used to say that before I even read Book Yourself Solid, which I really kind of just dug into in probably the last year and a half, since I've been part of the Book Yourself Solid and the Black Diamond Club network. That used to be my whole thing. It still is. To my core is that you need to tell your authentic story and you need to share it with the world, right? And that's really important in sharing your why in your personal brand. And then here's where things get a little bit different in here. The 3 components of your personal brand, as written in chapter 3 or 1.3 of Book Yourself Solid, is those 3 components are your who and do what statement, your why you do it statement, and your tagline. And this is where I think it's a little bit confusing, just as we talked about those things, is I think that your who and do what statement is definitely more from a business standpoint. And one of the things that we do, we don't, I don't call, when I'm working with somebody, I don't call it a who and do what statement, but it's kind of the same thing. Is we always ask people, what's the number one problem that you solve, right? And that really kind of becomes that who and do what statement for them, because then underneath that, what we talk about is what's your unique, like what are 3 to 5 uniques that set you apart from your competition or anybody else, right? And some of those, excuse me, some of those uniques they come from your personal brand, but some of them don't. And some of them are unique to your business or the product or what you're selling, right? Or that problem that you're trying to solve. And so those things are really part of that makeup of your business brand, and the tagline, right? Like I said, we don't really do a tagline when we're doing personal brand, but we pull out a personal quote or a signature quote for somebody. And then your why you do it is more your personal brand. I don't necessarily put that in a corporate or business plan or strategy, but it becomes part of the messaging. We tie that why and that story, that piece, into the messaging of your company. And then that is what gets shared across building your brand awareness across social media and, all the different elements that you can share it as far as advertising and content, all of that.
Now I'm smiling because this is a topic that I really wanted you to talk about. And just the way you talked about that, we could just take that piece and say, yeah, that's it. Because now I'm speaking of me. When I would read 1.3, I stumbled at this part. Who and do what? And I'm thinking, well, who's my ideal client? Well, that's the business's ideal client. And what do I do for them? Well, that's, what's the business going to do? What's the outcome I'm going to get for them? But then I kept seeing it's in this personal spot, and I was just struggling mightily with that. And in our conversations leading up to this, in essence, what you're saying is, hey, give yourself permission to say who and do what is for the business. And if you want to who and do what for you, you can do that too. You don't have to not do that. And that way you could have both. But if you have it either in one or the other, have it over here in the corporate side, because that's a who and do what for your business. Who do you do work for and what do you do for them?
Right.
And just, it's like, hey, you have permission to think a little bit bigger and understand that it could be both. And now you're free to do it in both and say, hey, I get why I have that now. That just gives us the opportunity to understand this stuff. It's really powerful what you're talking about.
I think the other thing is that can be confusing is what type of business do you have, right? Because, and I think that there's where some confusion comes in, because if you are a coach or a very small business, right? Or a business of one.
You're so intertwined.
You're very intertwined. And so in that case, you may not have a company brand. You may just have a personal brand, but you've expanded that personal brand to include who your ideal client is, who it is that you want to do business. And so your who and do what statement would belong in that personal brand at that point.
Now that's another great comment, and you shared that with me, and that also opens up our mind to this idea of, at the right size, it all is just one thing. Now, one of the things you said, and I want you to talk about this, one of the things you said is, when the book was written versus now there's a greater book of knowledge on business versus personal brand than there was then. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because I say it like I know all about it, but I only know about it because you talked about it. So why don't you just talk about that?
Yeah, so I think, and again, I've only had exposure to the Book Yourself Solid plan, the strategy, the method, and I think it's good. And I think there's so much relatable in it to a lot of different business verticals that we're in, whether you're a business of one or whether you're growing a company of, greatness, right? I think, I feel like the book was probably written for that smaller business or that solopreneur, or maybe that person building their personal brand that wanted to grow into something, but didn't really look at where we were going or how things were changing, and then adding that additional piece of maybe a larger business, and how you actually intertwine the story of your why in with your who and do what of the business that you're creating.
Yeah, so today's session here that we're on, we're training in business versus personal brand. And our goal is to train any size business to understand the concept. So if you're listening and you're a solopreneur, you're reading it and everything as is written is absolutely 100% correct. Who and do what is personal brand. Mm-hmm. If you get into now, you're an entrepreneur and you have this many people and stuff like that, now you're going to grow your mind out a little bit and say, okay, well now some of this is breaking out and I have 2 columns for each of these things. Mm-hmm. And once we see that, and now we get up to a big brand like Apple and Steve Jobs, well, they clearly have 2 areas. Mm-hmm. And so when you get that sense of it all, it isn't like the book's right or wrong. It's more like, okay, where are you at and how does the book apply?
Right. Absolutely.
Once you get that, wow, it's a powerful book. We all know that. And once you get that clarity and how to understand this section, it frees you to really apply it and understand it and just be comfortable with it.
Good. I was going to say, I think that's really important, Paul, because I actually have talked to people that are strictly looking at the book and applying the principles in the book, and there's no deviation, right? It's like the book tells me to do it this way and I have to do it this way. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I do think that sometimes it allows you to stumble and get confused from the standpoint of, it's like, well, that doesn't quite fit me, but do I have to fit myself to the principle or the strategy in the book? And I think that what you can do is take the essence of what the book is teaching you or showing you how to do things, and then doing the best you can with that to continue to move forward in what you're creating. If that makes sense.
It does. Now, you've talked about a number of things in this section. Did you have another one you wanted to touch on here? The last one you hit was really a powerful one. The who and do what, the why, and the tagline. If I'm a solopreneur, personal brand all the way through. If I'm bigger than that, it starts to break into maybe 2 columns. And then if I'm even a corporate, still good, it's 2 columns, but you can clearly see them, but they still interact.
Yeah.
And so just that should be the lesson of the whole episode.
Yeah, it really is. It's really from that chapter, that standpoint, that's really what I underlined and where my confusion points were in what I teach people, right? Or I help people with when they're building their brands. And I was trying to myself look at, well, this is kind of what the strategy of the book is teaching and sharing with us. And how do I separate that between a personal brand and a business brand with what I'm already doing and how I'm helping other people? And so, so those are really the main points that I underlined, but it was important, especially in our conversation prior, that I think that understanding how your personal brand ties into that business or corporate brand, I think that it confuses this less, if that makes sense. Because when you're building your personal brand, again, it's the essence of you and everything that you put into it, and it's your why. And it's really what people take from getting to know you to make the decision of wanting to know more about your business and what you do, right? Who you are and what you do. and then why you do it. And so if you know what your why is, then you can add that little piece into the messaging that you're building for your business. But then you can expand on it as your business grows, but you'll always have that essence of your personal brand. And then if you sell your business or make a decision to leave the business or do something, you're not leaving your personal brand behind. You're taking it with you, and you're allowed to put that into something else that you want to work on. And the business has your foundation to continue to build on.
Lots of entrepreneurs talk about exit strategies. So what you just described is really important to them.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you? Because when you exit that business for all the reasons that they started it to get to that point, you're taking who you are with you. Know who that is, know what that brand is, and then you go out and now you're not lost, floundering around. You're still who you are.
Right.
So
absolutely.
That's really pretty good there.
Yeah. So
Well,
that is my take on that particular chapter in Book Yourself Solid.
Yeah, no, that's good. Just in talking to you over the past couple of weeks to get ready, I have found a lot of clarity in this subject. And I found that, like in so many things, there's a dualism for us to understand. Mm-hmm. We have personal brand, we have business brand, and we can separate those out and make them completely different and never touching each other, but that will just create trouble for us. Mm-hmm. And it's better for us to say, hey, here's my personal brand, here's my business brand, and look at how they intermingle. Mm-hmm. And if we can get to that sense and say, wow, I get that, and I can feel that. And so over in the business, it is business, but I can feel myself here. I think that's what we're aiming for, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, just to, as the world is changing, and we're a couple years-ish removed from what was the pandemic, and where we didn't have those personal relationships and we didn't have those face-to-face, and things changed for everybody in a heartbeat. And I think that authentic side of your personal brand is even more important going forward, because, and I've seen this just with the companies that I've worked with and the people that I've worked with, and the questions that come in from ads and social media, there is this need to build these authentic relationships and feel like you have an authentic relationship with the people that you're doing business with. And so our sales cycles are becoming longer because people are taking longer to vet you and to trust you and to feel like they know you before they actually start doing business with you. And that leads to a lot of differences in how we put together our messaging, how we build our ads, how we build our websites, and the context of how we bring people into our world. It's very different than it was 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And in some ways, I think that's really good, because I think we get to see the human side of business. It's not so transactional anymore. But for those that want a quick ROI, or they want 100 leads tomorrow, it's a much slower process. It's a much longer game, because people are really wanting to learn, understand, gather all the knowledge, and see you before they do business with you.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, listen, Jen, we've been at this for a little while. I think we've covered this subject in some depth. There's always more to talk about when we talk about business versus personal brand. But this was our first episode, just a teaching episode to focus on a particular topic. And I'm going to say this out loud. I'd love to have you on again to do another topic.
Would love to.
That would be fun. But with this topic, I'm feeling like this is good for today. There's a lot to
Mm-hmm.
chew on. We've sort of summed it up with, okay, stop that fight between personal and business brand. Learn what the personal is, learn what the business is, and start to work out both and see how they mingle
Mm-hmm.
together and be comfortable with all that. And then you don't have to be confused. And if you have a who and do one statement in both, great for you. If your neighbor
Mm-hmm.
doesn't, they're not doing it wrong. It's okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it just depends on where people are at and their size and all those other things. And I think if we can do that, if somebody gets all of that out of this session today, I think that that would be a good outcome for us.
I agree. And to help people with that, one of the things that we're putting together is a little workbook that kind of goes through a personal brand and a company brand in not a lot of depth, but it kind of gives you the guidelines of the things to think about. And you can take notes and write things down as you're putting things together. And it really will show you the separation of what we shared today. And so we will drop that link in the description of the podcast. So
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that. I know you have put that together. I was very excited about you offering that in today's session, so I'm glad you did that. Thank you for that. If you're watching, we're going to tell you what to do in the post itself. So we'll give you a link and you can go to the link and get it. And that's a free download, right, Jen?
yes, absolutely. Yep.
Great. And I have one question. I don't know where you're at on this, but if somebody pulled that download and then said, Jen, I filled this out. I just want to talk to you for an hour. Can I have an hour session so we can look at this? Is there anything like that that they can do?
Yeah, absolutely. We can set something like that up where we can do a couple of things. We can just do, a coaching strategy or just a quick like workshop. If we want to workshop through something, we can set that up. We could do like an hourly rate type of thing to do that. If somebody is actually looking to put together, we do something called a RISE roadmap, which we take people through creating their entire marketing strategy. And we start with kind of that brand messaging. And we can do that from a personal brand standpoint. We can do that through a company brand standpoint. If that's something that somebody would like to just do, and go through that process, we can also just do that process and work through that with somebody as well. So
Perfect. What's your website?
it is 5, the number 5, and rise, RISE.com.
Awesome. I'm Paul Rakowicz with PR Vocal Coaching, Jen White with 5 and Rise. And we are so glad to have been able to share all of this message with you. Jen, any final words?
It's been my pleasure, Paul. I love diving into any type of marketing topic. And I think that bringing clarity around this particular subject, I hope it helps all of you that are listening.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Jen. Thank you all for watching. We will see you again in the next episode. If you have some comments, leave some comments, email one or the two of us, whatever you'd like to do. Let us know if this was helpful. We're going to share it. I just hope that people get a chance to watch it and learn something from it. And if that's true, then we feel as though we've done something helpful. All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We'll see you later. Until next time, be well.
Thanks, Paul.